Okay, so here we are into part 2 of the tutorial. First thing we're going to do is just optimize the scene down. As you can see, when I click and try to drag around, everything is very slow. So the first thing we could do to speed the scene up is come to the display menu, change the level of detail to say low. Okay, so the sphere has so many segments it still looks pretty detailed, but you can see the polygon count has reduced down and our clones have reduced considerably, and now I can move around in the scene and everything seems to be working at a reasonably fast pace. The problem with using a low level of detail is that if we, for instance, add in another object like a sphere, it will appear very low polygon and we'll lose a lot of detail. The other thing is if we're working with things like text spline, again you can see how it's very low quality. If we set our level of detail back to high, you can see that the quality returns. So using low level of detail is one option, but this isn't necessarily prudent to do it for the whole scene. So what can we do about that? One thing we can do is we can use a display tag, and if we put that onto our cloner, that can be used to reduce the level of detail. The thing is, in this instance, if we put it on the cloner, it won't actually make any difference because the cloner is using the object vertices on which to clone. So that is the object that we actually need to reduce the detail on. So if we select our sphere, choose tags, Cinema 4D tags, display tag, up come the attributes for the display tag. Here we can check level of detail. We can reduce this down to say 25. Another thing we could do is we can also switch on a different type of shading mode. But before we do that, let's just enable the sphere. Let's press O to frame that object. If we enable the cloner and the cylinder and our two effectors, you can see that we have a very similar result to when we set our level of detail to low, but if we come in here we can see the level of detail is still set to high. The other thing that we could do is we could select our cloner, add a display tag here, and this time we can adjust the shading mode. So let's just switch that to lines and choose box, and you can see that if we move in close, that our cloner is now represented with a box for each clone rather than the actual geometry. So this can speed the scene up somewhat. As you can see now, it is much more workable. If we hit render, however, it will render with a low level of detail. We can come into the display menu, level of detail, and choose use render level of detail for editor rendering, in which case it will use the higher level for when we hit render. In this example that will slow it down because it's taking 20 to 30 seconds to kind of render the scene, so I'm going to leave it as it is, and we'll just remember to disable our display tag level of detail when we go to do the final output. Okay, so I'm just going to use the incremental save incremental here to save the next version of this. The next thing I'm going to do is select my plane effector, come into the fall off and just uncheck visible, because I find that quite distracting. So now we've reached this point, we can start to bring in the text that we want to orbit around our sphere. To do that, I'm going to use some text that I prepared in Illustrator. So let's move over to Illustrator first of all and just have a look at how I've set that up, and then we'll come back into Cinema 4D and we will import the text and look at some methods of orbiting it around the globe. Here we are in Adobe Illustrator, and you can see I've prepared some of the text. First thing to note is that the text has been converted to outlines. If we just view the outlines, you can see that. So if you're working with fonts, you will need to make sure that you create outlines before you export that ready for importing into Cinema 4D. The other thing that I've done is I've moved the position of the rulers. Now normally the 0, point in Illustrator down in this bottom right corner of the document. If we just select our two words, we create a bounding box, and on this bounding box you can see we have these handles which represent the kind of center of the box. If we come to this top corner here, we can drag down, which creates a crosshair. We can then position this crosshair using those handles as a guide so that it's roughly in the center of our Illustrator artwork. So if I release that now, you can see that we have the 0 ruler here and the 0 ruler here. This will correspond to the world 0 when we import this into Cinema 4D. So if you didn't reset that, all that would happen when you import this spline is that the world 0 would be down here. So your Illustrator artwork may well be off center and you might not see it in the camera view depending on how far away from this point it is. So it's not essential to do that, just makes it slightly easier when you're bringing it into Cinema 4D. Okay, the final thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we export this as a version that is compatible with Cinema 4D, and you need to use a version such as version 8 or below. So the best thing is to choose Save As. Okay, and I'm just going to call this 01. Save. In the next dialog, choose Illustrator 8 and then OK, and that will mean that the format is suitable to be imported into Cinema 4D. Now I have a few of these set up. See underneath here we have latest sports. I could have saved them all as one Illustrator document, but what would have happened is when we import that into Cinema we would have had hundreds and hundreds of paths and it could have got quite confusing. So I tend to separate each piece of artwork into a separate document and import them one by one, just to make life a little bit easier when we're importing that into Cinema. So I've set these Illustrator documents up and saved them out as version 8, so now we can move back to Cinema 4D and we can look at importing them. So back in Cinema 4D, and we have a couple of options of importing our Illustrator artwork. First thing we could do is we could choose File, Open. If we choose File, Open, then it will create a new scene in Cinema 4D and we can work on our Illustrator artwork there. If you'd like to bring the artwork into the document you're currently working on, you can go to the Object Manager and choose File, Merge Objects. So I'm going to use the Merge Objects command and to bring the Illustrator artwork in. Once you've merged the Illustrator artwork into Cinema 4D, it will appear in the Object Manager. Now there's a few ways that it may appear. Mine has come in as a null object with all the paths grouped under the null. Now you can change the way the import action occurs in your preferences. So let's just have a quick look at this. If we come down to Edit Preferences, and if you come to Import, you can fold this down, and let's just scroll down, and here we have Illustrator Import. So as you can see, I have group splines connected, and this puts the splines under a null, and then I also have connect splines connected. I have the scale set to 1. What connect splines does is that we'll take things like an O or an A, which are made up of more than one part, and it will connect them together to make one spline. So if we come back to our artwork, let's just hide our sphere for a moment, rotate around. You can see if I click through the different splines, for instance, path 3 is the O of stories, and it's actually, although it's made of 2 segments, it's one spline object. Again for the R, and on the O and P of top, it's the same. So it really depends on the type of artwork that you're importing, whether you want Cinema to do this, and it does guess and it doesn't always get it right, so you may spend a little bit of time just adjusting your paths once you've brought them in, just so that they're set up for the needs of the scene. Currently we have all our letters as separate splines. What we could do is we could add in an extrude NURBS object. We could select all of these paths, drag them into our extrude, and then in the object we could select hierarchical. So we now have our text extruded, and we could leave it like this. For this example, however, what I'd like to do is I'd like top and stories to actually be 2 separate extrude objects so that we can set the parameters slightly differently. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my paths, and I don't really want each letter as a separate path, so I'm going to first of all join them together so that they make up one spline, and then I'm going to use 2 extrude NURBS, one for top and one for stories. So if we just deselect or disable the extrude NURBS first of all, I can see that path 1 is the S of stories and path 9 is the last S. So if we shift click between those, we can select all of them. If you then right click, come down and choose connect, what will happen is Cinema will connect all those paths into one path. And here it is, and you can see that now this is the stories spline. I use spline and path They both kind of mean the same thing. Quite happy to use whichever word you feel more comfortable with. I'm just going to rename this stories. And then we have 3 left here, so let's just select those, right click, choose connect, and we have our top spline. So we can delete the original paths from under the extrude NURBS. One thing that we will notice here is if we choose stories, you can see that the axis is here in world center. If we choose top, the axis is here in world center. So if we rotate now, this is going to rotate from that point. That isn't necessarily where you want it to be. So you may well want to have your axes in the center of all of the points. If we have the object selected and we come to our structure menu, we have something in here called Axis Center. So let's open that up. And what Axis Center does is it allows you to manipulate the axes of objects. And at the moment I want to set this to be in the center of all points. This is the default setting, so we can just click execute and you can see that the axis moves to the center of the top spline. If we select stories and just do the same thing, you can see the axis then moves to the center of stories. You can also adjust it so that it moves to, for instance, Y100 here or Y-100. So you can position the axes in lots of different places depending on where you need it. For instance, if you want to move the position of rotation. So if you've used After Effects, it's a bit similar to using moving the anchor point. Okay, so we now have top and stories set up how we like. I'm going to import the splines used for latest sports. So I've used the file merge command again, and here we have the latest sports, and this is coming in a similar way to the top stories, so we have all our paths separately. So I'm just going to go through and connect them together as before. We can now delete this group of splines and let's rename these so that we know which object corresponds to which word. Okay, so if we just take stories and sports and we drop them into this extrude, let's just switch on the tick to enable the splines and the extrude object. Let's also add another extrude and let's drop latest and top into this, and also again check hierarchical. The reason I'm doing this is just so that I can set up the extrude object settings for all of the words rather than doing it separately for each one. So for the bottom words I'm going to use an extrusion depth of 30 on Z, and you can see when I hit return that the letters actually get slightly deeper. And for the smaller words at the top, I'm going to use an extrusion depth of 15. For both of these objects, I'm going to switch to caps and choose fillet cap. And you notice that that gives us this rounding on the front of our objects. For the smaller words at the top, I'm going to use a radius of 1. I'm going to set this for the front and the back. And for the larger words at the bottom, I'm going to use a radius of 2. If we hit render, although the words are overlapping, you should be able to see that we now have this nice beveled edge and we have all our words set up. Now they're set up, because we've used the hierarchical switch in our extrude object, what that means is if we press C on the keyboard, this will then split this into a separate extrude object for each spline. So if you had all your letters as separate splines, you could put them under one extrude NURBS and set it up like we have. Press C and you'll have a separate extrude for each letter. So if I do this now, you can see that when I unfold the hierarchy, I have a separate extrude NURBS for sports and a separate for stories. Let's do the same for the top words too. So I'll just press C, and again we have latest and top. So now we can drag these out of the hierarchy like so, and we can delete the nulls that are left behind. If we just want to check that that's worked correctly, let's first of all disable top and stories, hit render, there we have latest sports, and then let's disable the others and hit render, and we have top stories. So we can see that our extrude objects are all set up correctly. The next thing I'd like to do is take the text and have it orbit around our sphere, and to do that what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the letters and attach them to a spline. Now we could do this using the align to spline tag, but if we do that what will happen is it will take the whole word as one group and it will move around like so. I'd like to attach each separate letter and do it that way. Now we can do that using MoGraph, although these aren't actually MoGraph objects. In other words, they aren't the cloner, matrix, fracture, instant, text, etc. objects. MoGraph does have one object included with it that allows us to take a regular Cinema 4D object and then we can use the effectors, etc. with it. And that object is called the fracture object. And what we're going to do is we're going to just have a quick look at how the fracture object works, and then we'll use that to attach our letters to a spline. First of all, I'm going to move top down here so it's with stories, and I'm then just going to alt double click on the traffic lights to hide latest sports. So now we have top and stories. If we click on them, you can see where the axes is for each. I'd like the fracture object to be in the same place. So with stories selected, I'm going to hold alt down and just add the fracture object. I'm just going to rename this fracture stories. As you can see, the fracture object does also transform the color. We can use that to our advantage. I'm going to just make it pure white for now so that it's nice and bright in our scene and we can see it clearly as it orbits around our sphere. Now that we have the fracture object as a parent of stories, that means that it takes the extrude object and then it regenerates a MoGraph object using the settings that we choose in the object tab. So switch to the object tab on the fracture object, and here we have a mode, and the mode that is default is called straight, and what that means is that it just takes the object as it is and doesn't do anything to it and just converts it so that it can be used with MoGraph effectors. So with the fracture object selected, let's add in an effector. For this example, I'm just going to use the random effector. Okay, and this has its parameter set to position, so it is randomizing the position of the stories object, and you can see that it's moved it slightly. If we come to the effector settings, we can adjust the strength so that the position is increased or decreased. One thing you'll notice is that the whole of stories is moved as one object, whereas we would like to affect each individual letter. So if we come back to our fracture object and come to the mode, let's have a look and see what other options we have. In here we can choose to explode segments. As I said before, this is a multi-segment spline. So in other words, each letter is a different segment, but they've all been connected together to make one spline. So in other words, the stories extrude object is essentially made of separate segments. So in the fracture object, let's choose explode segments. Okay, and you can see that immediately that has a bit of a drastic change. Now the thing is, using this setting, is that it does treat our extrude NURBS caps and fillets as separate segments. So although it has separated all the letters, it has also separated our caps and roundings. So when we hit render, you can see that everything is randomized and it does create quite a lot of a mess. In certain situations, you can create some pretty cool effects using this. The fracture object does offer another mode, which is the one that we're going to use, and if we click on the pop-up list, we can see that. Explode segments and connect. So what this does is it explodes the segments as before, but then it connects any parts that are joined. And what I mean by joined is if they share the same point, then they will be connected back together to make one solid object. So where we have a letter such as the S, we have then the fillet or the rounding, and then we have the cap. They all share points, so those points will all be joined together and we'll end up with individual letters. So I've selected that option. You can see that now it's treating each letter individually, but we've kept our caps and our fillets as part of each letter. So if we come to our random effector and we could change the seed, for instance, you can see that it's still keeping all our letters together. We can increase and decrease the effect, the strength of that effector, and our letters still all stay together. So let's just delete the random effector. We don't need that. I just use that as an example to show you the different modes in the fracture object. One thing you may notice is that the shading has gone a little bit funky. If you look at the word top, you can see that it's nice and neat. Doesn't look strange at all, but if you look at stories, you can see that we have some really strange, odd shading. Now the reason it's like this is because of the thong angle. You'll notice that the fracture object doesn't actually have a thong tag, and what's happened is it's exploded the segments, and all the caps and everything have become separate, and then it's joined them back up, but it's not sure of how to treat the angles and the joins. So the easiest way to get around this is to take the thong tag which we have already on our extrude object. If we just drag that onto the fracture, that should fix it. Okay, there we go. So if we hit render now, you can see that we have successfully created a fracture object from our stories extrude NURBS, and it's a simple case of selecting the top extrude NURBS, hold Alt down, add in a new fracture object. Let's select explode segments and connect. Let's also switch the color transformation to bright white, and finally drag the thong tag onto this. I'm just going to rename this fracture top. And now we have two fracture objects, one for top and one for stories. So we're ready to add some splines, so we can then attach these letters to our splines, and hopefully they'll be orbiting around our sphere in no time at all. To add a spline, we need to know what size to make it. So let's just select our sphere that we've used first of all, and the radius of this is 400. We can enable these now. This will hide our text as it's inside the center of that at the moment, but not to worry. If we just press O to frame the active object and come up to the spline menu, and let's add in a circle spline. So I want the radius of this to be bigger than 400, so I'm going to choose 500 for now. Okay, and there's our spline. You can see that at the moment it's on the wrong plane. We'd like to come around where the equator is really, so we can come to the plane pop-up and just choose XZ. So now we have our first spline in place. So we're going to use an effector to attach our letters to this spline. So let's first of all attach stories. So if we select the fracture object, with it selected, when we add an effector, it will automatically be added to the effectors list. So with that selected, let's choose MoGraph Spline Effector. Okay, and if we come back to our fracture stories, you can see that that spline effector is indeed added into the effectors list straight away. So on the spline effector, I'm just going to rename this stories, and let's have a look at the attributes for this effector. I'm going to pull the attribute manager over slightly so we can just see the settings more clearly. So if we come down, let's have a look at the effector first of all. So the strength is 100, the mode is step, and next we have a field for a spline. So what we do is we take our circle spline and we drag it into that field. We need to just click it and drag it rather than click on it. And you can see immediately that our word stories has been attached to the spline. The result, however, isn't quite as desired, but we can go through the settings and adjust that as we need to. Let's just rename our circle spline circle stories. In due time we'll have a separate spline for each of our fracture objects, so it's a good idea to just name things as you go. Saves tidying it all up at the end. So the first thing that you'll probably notice is that the letters are spread out too far, and the other thing is that they're actually at the wrong angle. So let's come back to our spline effector. In here we have a mode. At the moment it's set to step. Well, what we can do, because we're using a word and we want to keep the spacing between the letters the same, is we can choose relative, and what that does is it allows the spacing between any of the objects, whether it's from a fracture object or a cloner, etc., to remain relatively the same. So first of all we'll choose relative. Okay, and then we want to choose which axis we want to have as the relative offset. Our text was set up along X, but if you'd set it up any other way, then you could adjust this accordingly. And the next thing to do is to adjust the start and the end positions. As we do this, you can see that the letters move around. So what this is going to do is going to join our letters up, but we're going to keep the relative spacing. Although the letters are still at the wrong angle, you should be able to see that there's something wrong too. It's actually backwards. So instead of it saying stories from this end, it's starting at this end. So if we were looking at it from the inside of the spline, then perhaps it would be okay, but from this side we need it to be the other way around. Now the reason for that is because actually the spline is the wrong way round. If we click on our circle spline, you'll notice that in here we have an option to reverse. Now all splines have a direction, they have a start and an end point. With a parametric spline such as this, you can't see that. If I just press C first of all to make that editable, you'll notice that the spline changes to a colour. And here we have a very light blue travelling all the way around to a dark blue, and what that signifies is, first of all, this is the first point and the last point on the spline, and secondly that this is the beginning and then the end. So with the spline made editable, we can come to the structure menu, choose edit spline and then choose reverse sequence. If I just choose that, you can see that the sequence changes to the other way round. However, I'm just going to choose undo and undo again. This then makes this back into a parametric spline. Because it's parametric, we have the option built in, so there's no need to actually make this editable unless we really wanted to edit the actual shape or add in some extra points. I just showed you that previous menu item in case you're working on a spline that you've drawn yourself, or perhaps one you've imported from Illustrator. Okay, so with the circle spline, let's come back to the attributes manager here and let's just click reverse, and you can see that now our word stories is actually in the correct order. Okay, you're right, the letters are upside down and they're also at the wrong angle, so we need to make some adjustments on our spline effector, but at least it's actually travelling in the right way. So let's come back to our spline effector. In here we can adjust some of the settings. So if we come to parameter, we have transformation. So here we can transform our individual letters. First of all, let's adjust P. So now we turn them the right way up. If we set that to 180. The next thing we need to do is just adjust the heading. If we set this to -90, you can see that now our letters are facing the right way. The angles are relative to the spline, so if we come back to the Effector tab and choose Offset, we can now move our text around the spline as if it's orbiting the Earth. Let's just frame this slightly better and zoom in. The spacing is a bit too far apart at the moment, so we're going to need to come in and just adjust this. I think it probably wants to be around 87, maybe a little bit lower, something like 85, looks about right. Okay, so we've set up our first spline effector with the word stories. Now we've set that up, we can simply duplicate our spline, we can duplicate our spline effector and just add in the correct objects, and hopefully it'll be a quicker procedure to set up the word top. So now we have all of our words in a fracture object for each one. We have a separate spline for each word, and we also have a separate spline effector for each word. So with fracture latest selected, I'm going to take the spline effector latest, drag that into the effectors field. You can see that the latest has immediately been attached to the spline. I'm just going to come to the fracture object and adjust my colour first of all. Come to the spline effector, and for the start I'm going to set that to be 92. And then for these fracture sports, again let's adjust the colour to white. In the effectors, let's drag in spline effector sports. Come to the spline effector. Notice that I've already dragged in the correct spline, and I think that we need to choose 87. As I said before, we can always come back and adjust the spacing. I think latest actually looks like it is a little bit spread out. So 92.5 perhaps. Okay, so we have latest sports and we have top stories now attached to our splines. It's a good point to save incremental, and we can move on and look at how we could set up the animation for these. When we come to animating these later on in the tutorial, we'd probably like to have as few keys as possible so that there's less to adjust when it comes to that kind of crucial tweaking of all our keyframes. Now the obvious thing to animate on these is the offset. If we scrub this value, you can see that it offsets the object along the spline. Now what I'd ideally like to do is set this up so that these are kind of laid out how I'd like the type to sit, and then just animate one of these parameters so that it affects both. I'll also just show you how you can do this and some of the flexibility that it offers. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually do a small part in Xpresso. We're not really going to even need to open the Xpresso editor, although we will have a look in there just to see what's happened, but we're going to do it just using some built-in commands. And what this is called is it's called set driven keys in certain applications. And basically what you do is you set a certain parameter that you'd like to drive another parameter, and then you set another parameter that is the driven parameter. For instance, imagine having a cylinder, and as you adjust the heading of the cylinder, it adjusts the brightness of a light. Using that kind of technique, you could easily create a dimmer switch, and you wouldn't need to animate both parameters kind of in tangent with each other. So what we can do is we can say, as we animate the offset of latest, that it also animates the offset of sports. So with the spline effect at latest selected, let's right click on the offset parameter. Here we can choose animation, and then we choose set driver. We then come to the parameter that we'd like to drive, so we select spline effector sports, right click on the offset parameter and choose animation set driven. We can use the absolute option here because both parameters are the same and we'd like them to be the same value. When we click there, you notice that it adds an Xpresso tag. If we just double click that to open our Xpresso editor, you can see that here we have our spline effector latest object node. The offset parameter has an output coming into a range mapper. The value from that is output into the offset on the spline effector sports. We could always just link this value straight into there, and that would effectively achieve the same thing, because if we look at the range mapper, you can see here that our input value is on the lower is 0 and our input upper is 100%, and the parameter output is exactly the same. So the range mapper here isn't doing a lot. It's basically inputting a certain value and it's outputting exactly the same. However, it is a very, very flexible node. Let's just have a look to make sure that this is working first of all. So if we select our spline effector latest, we know that the offset parameter is driving the offset of the sports layer. And there you go, and you can see that as we do that, it's moving both objects. And if we switch to our spline effector sports, you can see that the offset value here has adjusted. If we try and change this, it will jump back, because this value here is now controlled by this Xpresso tag, so we can only adjust that if we adjust this actual offset. So you may think, well, okay, we've done that, but the latest text isn't where I want it to be, so how can we fix that? How can we change the position of latest without moving sports? Because if we change the offset of latest, then sports moves with it. And the easiest way to do that is just to adjust the spline that they're attached to. So if we come up to here, we have circle latest, the spline, come to our coordinates. If we adjust the heading, you can see that this adjusts the spline and the offset there is reflected in the object that's attached to it. So I think that it should probably be something like this. Again, we can fine-tune all these aspects as we move through the project. Now when we adjust our offset on latest, you can see that they still move together, and we've actually adjusted our layout so it's slightly more suitable. So if we come back into our Xpresso, what exactly is the advantage of putting the range mapper in here? Well, the thing with the range mapper is it takes one set of parameters or values and it maps them to a different set. So for instance, we could input percent and we could output degrees. We could input 0 to 100, we could output 0 to 1000, so that you can use the range mapper to convert values from one object's parameter to another object's parameter. Another example, even here we're using percent for both. If we take the output lower and set that to 100, and we take our output upper and set that to 0, we've effectively reversed the values. So what happens now when we scrub the spline effector latest offset? As you can see, because we reverse the values, they move in opposite directions. So just by using a little bit of Espresso, you can make your animation much easier to achieve, and you can also make things like this very simple. So we could set a couple of keys, we could come in, we could adjust the Espresso in the range mapper, and without even changing any of the parameters or values on our keys, the animation would change quite drastically. Okay, I'm just going to come back in, select my range mapper, and just set this to be 0 and 100 because I want them to actually stay the same. I just thought I'd show you that because it's quite a handy little tip of using Espresso to link two parameters. So the last thing that I'm going to do here is just select the spline effector top, and again add in a set driven key. So let's set driver. Well, I've just clicked by accident in there. And let's go to our spline effector stories, and then on the offset choose set driven absolute. And now if we enable and unhide this object, we can see that that's also working. I'm just going to hide latest sport so we can see that a little bit more clearly. You can see here we have top stories set up, and again we can come to our circle top and we can adjust the heading so we can lay out the type in a slightly more interesting way. Cool stuff. So that's looking better. So we're kind of set up in a way to do some animation here. We're not going to actually animate these yet. We're going to add in a few more elements. I think we need to have a camera and stuff in there first of all so we know how we're framing our objects. But as we move through, all these things are becoming set up. One thing I would like to do is just organise my scene a little bit now, because as you can see we're getting quite a few objects in the object manager. We don't want it to become too cluttered. So let's just have a look at how we could organise this. Actually, before I do that, there's one more thing I think I'll just make an adjustment to the scene. Although we're not going to position these accurately right now, we can do that when we have a camera in there and we can frame the composition a lot more accurately. I think they'd look a little bit more interesting if they were at angles. So what we could do is we could select our splines and we could adjust the pitch or the bank of these, like so. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to first of all add in a null. Let's call this circle null 01. Make these two objects a child. Now they're in a null, we can easily select that null and we can kind of adjust the banking to suit without having to do each individual spline. Okay, I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to set these because we'll do that when we've got a camera in the scene, but I just thought I'd set it up first. Again, we can call this circle null 02, and let's select latest and sports and drag those in. Unhide the two objects, and let's just select this and set that to be, say, 5. So they're kind of at opposing angles. I think when we animate them on, it will look a little bit more interesting like so. So the objects, the scene is taking shape quite nicely now. Everything's coming together. As I said before, it's a good idea to start to organise the scene now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use layers for that. First thing we need to do is come to the window menu and choose layer browser. And now layers are here to organise your scene, to show what objects belong to which layer. And the easiest way to demonstrate that is to show you. What I'm going to do is just dock this into my layout first of all, and then resave the layout. So as you know from before, we just choose make tab if we want to put it here, and I can just drag this down, and now I have my layer browser in the layout too. I'm going to save this over the layout that I already have. So again, you go window layout, save layout as, and then you choose the location. So now I've done that, whenever I choose my MotionWorks layout, I'll have my layer browser in there. To create a layer, you can choose File, New Layer, or you can select an object, and in this part here, Add to New Layer, or you can just double click in the layer browser. So here we have a new layer that's been created, and I'm going to call this MoGraph Text. Add another new layer, I'm going to call this Effectors. Add another new layer, MoGraph Generic, for all my generic motion graphic elements. Scene elements, and finally lights, cameras. Okay, and we can keep adding these, and if we need any others, it's not a problem. You can also double click on the little swatch here and you can change the color, so you can color coordinate all your layers. And as you can see, where we've added some layers, we have this whole list of icons that appear afterwards, and a letter above each column to give us an idea of what they do. So first of all, MoGraph text. Let's add some objects to this. So we have our stories, top, sports, and latest. If we shift click to select all of those and drag them into MoGraph text, watch what happens. They all get kind of the color of the layer appears here, so you can see immediately which layer they are on. One thing to note though is if we fold these down, notice that the children objects aren't added to that layer. So let's just undo for now. If you press Control and drag onto the layer, notice that all the children are also added to that layer. The other thing to note as well is that any tags on that object will be added to that layer. And now that may or may not be preferable depending on how you'd like to set up your scene. There's no reason that you need to use the same layers that I have, but it's a good idea to start using them just to manage your scenes. Okay, so I have my sphere to clone onto. I'm going to use that and press Control and drag this onto MoGraph generic. I have all my effectors here, so I can Control drag these onto effectors. And then I have these circle objects. Now these, I'm not sure where shall I put these. Really they're to do with the MoGraph text. Although they're not actually text, they're actually part of those objects. So I'm going to use the Control T and grab them into MoGraph text. So my naming isn't necessarily making sense, but it kind of makes sense because without these then the text wouldn't do what it needs to do. And the reason it's like that is, for instance, if I just want to look at the latest sports and the top stories part, I can choose solo of that layer, and you can see that in the actual editor everything has disappeared. In the object manager everything's disappeared. So now I can just work on those particular objects if I need to adjust the splines. If I also want to have my effectors, I can just press solo on the effectors and I can work with the effectors at the same time. The other thing that we have here is we have visibility, so we can switch our layer so it's visible or invisible. This affects the editor view, and as you can see we can still see them in the manager. We can switch off for rendering, so you may have certain elements in your scene that you don't want to render that are there just for a guide, that kind of thing. So if you put them on a layer, you could call it non-rendering, and then you can disable rendering for that layer. This column refers to whether it's visible in a manager or not. So here we can disable that, and you notice that that layer disappears from the object manager. Here we can lock a layer, so that then locks those items, and you can see that they become grayed out, so we can't actually select or do anything with them. So if you've set stuff up and you don't want to do anything to it, you can lock it, and again the lock is reflected in the layer color. This column here refers to animation. We don't have any animation yet, so we can't really demonstrate that, but what that does is it switches animation on or off. This one refers to generators, so if we switch that off, none of the generators on that layer will work. Now a fracture object's a generator, as is an extrude, so that makes everything disappear. Deformers, if we use any deformers we can disable them, and here expressions and coffee, etc. So if we uncheck that, then none of our expressions will work. So you can see that layers are pretty useful, and you can set up layers for specific purposes. For now I think this will be okay. So I'm just going to use my save incremental, and we shall move on to the next part of the tutorial. In the next part of the tutorial, what we're going to do is we're going to add in a camera and make a very basic camera rig so we can start to frame our scene, and we're going to set it up so the camera is slightly easier to animate than just using a camera on its own. We're going to use a few null objects in there as well. So I hope you enjoyed it so far, and I shall see you in the next part. Thanks very much.